Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Batman Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth. Now, this is a graphic novel written by Grant Morrison, illustrated by Dave McKean, and published by DC Comics in 1989. And this features the character of Batman, originally created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger. Now, I'm doing this review as part of my yearly series of Batman reviews, which is something I do at the beginning of every year. Now, I actually have reviewed this book twice before. I first reviewed it all the way back in 2014, but then in 2017 I redid that review, and my 2017 review of this book is still up. However, it's no longer public. It's now marked as unlisted, but you can still see it with a link which I'll leave in the description below. Now, the way this video is going to be structured is the beginning portion, which you're watching now, is going to be more of a general assessment of the book, but most of the video is actually going to be an in-depth, spoiler-filled discussion on this graphic novel with my friend Bill Burns. Now, when this was first published, it was coming off the heels of Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns and Alan Moore's The Killing Joke, and the Tim Burton Batman film came out a few months before this. And I would say this, Dark Knight Returns and Killing Joke, are the three Batman comics that really took the Batman storyline and made it much darker and much more grounded, and really started gearing it more towards adult readers. And they showed at least mainstream readers that you could tell very complex, mature stories using this character, which was kind of a big deal at the time, because at the time these comics came out, most of the mainstream's perceptions of Batman was the 60s Adam West TV show, which was infamously goofy, and intentionally so, because the 60s Batman show was basically a comedy and was more of a parody of the Batman comics than anything else. And this was also during a period in comics where writers were really starting to deconstruct the concept of superheroes. You saw Alan Moore do that with The Killing Joke, and with his run on Swamp Thing, as well as in his groundbreaking graphic novel, Watchmen, and to a lesser extent, Neil Gaiman sort of did that with the Sandman series. And Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth, sort of continues that tradition. Now, the fact that this is a Batman story is almost inconsequential to the book itself, because this is really a psychological horror story that just happens to use Batman and other characters from the Batman mythos as window dressing, and what this really is it's a haunting and nightmarish meditation on insanity and the nature of time. And I've always considered Arkham Asylum to be sort of a ghost story in a way. Not necessarily in a literal sense. I mean, there is a subtle undercurrent of magic in the supernatural, but there's this whole idea of time being the ghost. This idea that the past is always present, and in this story you see the past and the present overlap each other to a point where it almost seems like the past and the present are happening simultaneously, just in two different dimensions. Now, I don't know if this graphic novel is considered to be canon to the mainstream Batman/DC continuity, but frankly, I read this as a purely standalone story. In my opinion, it works better that way. Like, as far as I'm concerned, this is practically an Elseworld story. Now, the book has a lot of literary allusions. It borrows heavily from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. It also seems to borrow a little bit from the Edgar Allan Poe short story, The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather. And the subtitle of this graphic novel, A Serious House on Serious Earth, comes from the Philip Larkin poem Churchgoin'. Now, I don't know if this was an influence on Grant Morrison for this story or not, but I also saw some parallels with Dante's Inferno, if you want to look at the asylum as being hell, and look at Batman as sort of a stand-in for Dante. Now, in speaking of literary allusions, this doesn't necessarily apply to this story, and I know Grant Morrison was not the person to come up with the concept of Arkham Asylum, but the name Arkham is a direct reference to H.P. Lovecraft. Now, as far as Lovecraft allusions in this particular story, there really aren't any on the surface, but I did notice some subtle Lovecraftian themes that probably weren't intentional, but I'll discuss that more later on in this video when I discuss the graphic novel with Bill. So, the plot of Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth, it's essentially two stories in one, and the two stories sort of run concurrently with each other. The main narrative focuses on the inmates at Arkham Asylum taking the staff hostage, and they'll only let the hostages go if Batman turns himself over to them, which he reluctantly does, and Batman in this story is portrayed as a man who's pretty much on the verge of a psychotic breakdown himself, which is why I like to think of this story as being in its own continuity, not connected to the mainstream continuity. But Batman is really starting to wonder if he's just as crazy as the people who he's helped lock up at Arkham Asylum. So the inmates let him wander throughout the asylum, and they're giving him 1 hour before they start coming after him. So throughout the story, Batman must confront his own inner demons. The parallel story is primarily set in the 1920s, and it follows this psychiatrist named Amadeus Arkham, who is the man who established Arkham Asylum, and we learn that when he was a child, he had to take care of his insane mother, so as an adult, he's dedicated his life to helping the mentally ill. But he is ultimately driven to insanity himself when a serial killer who he tried to help escapes and then goes after his wife and daughter. And we see the two narratives come together in a really interesting way. But yeah, Batman Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth, I think is an excellent comic. Not just an excellent Batman comic, but an excellent comic or graphic novel in general. Like, the fact that it's a Batman story is almost irrelevant. Like, this is just a great horror story, and it's one of my favorite horror novels, regardless of whether it has anything to do with Batman or superheroes. Like, it doesn't really have the feel of a superhero story. It has the feel of just this really dark, like I said, almost ghost story in a way. And this has some creepy freaking imagery in it. Like right at the beginning of the story, you see Arkham as a child bringing his mother something to eat, and we see that she's eaten beetles and cockroaches and like just shoved them in her mouth, and they start falling out of her mouth when he brings her something to eat, saying, "I've eaten." And Dave McKean's artwork is just freaking insane. And people who have read this graphic novel are probably familiar with the dollhouse scene, one of the creepiest scenes I've seen in any comic. But now I want to cut to me, my friend Bill Burns, discussing this graphic novel, and there will be some spoilers in our discussion. Alright, so now we're on to the discussion of this graphic novel, A Serious House on Serious Earth, with Bill Burns.
Hello, everyone.
I've read Arkham Asylum a few times now, but upon rereading it, I really noticed, like, all the references to magic and the occult, and I know Grant Morrison's, like, really hardcore into that shit, and the reason I wanted to discuss this graphic novel with you is I know you're a little more well-versed in that stuff than I am, so what do you think of Batman Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth?
Well, I mean, I actually read it when it first came out in 1989. I was a teenager, and I loved it when it first came out. Like, I was blown away. Like, there was so much of this esoteric kind of like knowledge and these references in there. Like, I only got like maybe 3/4 of them too, because obviously I had not done a lot of research or done a lot of reading in that field. But actually, the more times I come back to it, I actually taught it in a graphic novel class that I did. The more times I come back to it, I actually like it like a little. I still like it, but I like it a little less each time, because one of the things I feel about it is that although I love all the allusions and all the references, I don't feel that they're sort of sort of assimilated well or integrated well as that Morrison would later do with references. Like the series The Invisibles, I think to me that's one of his best works, because he doesn't let the references come in the way of the narrative. Sometimes I feel with Arkham Asylum, it's almost like he took a whole bunch of cool references, threw them at the wall, and whatever stuck, and then the other ones that don't really resonate as well through the narrative are kind of just left by the wayside. Like he doesn't go back to them, and doesn't they don't tie together as well as I think some of his later work does, using like a lot of this chaos magic and a lot of the things he was very into. But actually also too, I think that the more I read it, the more I realize that although yes, there is a lot of sort of occult and magic, references, I think there's actually a lot more psychology references, like Carl Jung, Jacques Lacan, and even going into sort of like Joseph Campbell, like some of his sort of beliefs in the archetypes that come throughout all different cultures. So I just still think it's a great work. I think later on Morrison was able to fashion it in a much more powerful way for his stories, so it didn't just feel like a string of references put together in a Batman story. I think he integrated these his ability to use those references much more strongly as he went on in his career. Obviously, too, the visuals, right? Dave McKean's visuals really emphasize that. I think he really took the sort of the themes that were there, and he just like ran wild with those themes. Like he just put it all on the page, and it's like just the horror leaks onto other panels and other pages. Like really, I don't think, honestly, I don't. And it's funny because I think Morrison's actually criticized McKean's artwork, but I don't think it would have been even half as powerful without Dave McKean's artwork.
Yeah, when I first read the graphic novel back in early 2014, I had some issues with the artwork at the time because I thought it was good artwork, but I didn't think it was appropriate for artwork that's telling a narrative story. But as time has gone by and I've read the graphic novel several times over the years, honestly, this would not be the same without Dave McKean's artwork. The story itself is good on its own, but Dave McKean's artwork makes it so much better. Like, Absolutely. If this had more generic artwork, I'm not sure if the comic would be as memorable. Which
is weird, because I read an interview with Grant Morrison where he said he wished that it was ultra-realistic artwork. Which, again, I mean, the story is good, but to me, without those visuals, it loses so much of its power. Yeah. And up to that point, I mean, I had only really seen Dave McKean's artwork on the cover of the Sandman covers. I didn't think he did some Hellblazer covers, too.
Yeah.
So I didn't realize that he could sustain a narrative. I had only seen the single pieces, and usually covers don't have a continuity with each other, But to see what he did in terms of the artwork here, it really sort of just resonates so strongly. And again, I have a feeling that maybe Grant Morrison made me be a little jealous, because I think some of the, I remember when the reviews came out for Arkham Asylum, everybody praised the artwork. Like, people would just lost their minds in terms of the artwork. And who knows, maybe he was a little jealous of that it took away a little of his, the attention a little bit away from him in terms of what he achieved in terms of his writing.
I also think the artwork does a great job at adding to the nightmarish feel of the story. Like, it almost feels like this is a nightmare put the page. Like, this is Batman's nightmare.
Sure. I also think, too, is that it's important that it's abstract, because, because I feel this work is really a critique of psychology. It's a critique of psychiatry, that that abstract kind of thing is you can look into it and see different things, rather than it being ultra realistic objective artwork, which has a more one-to-one correlation in terms of the meaning. It's almost like these are Rorschach ink blots, the panels, and you could you see different things, and the more you look at it, the more things pop out. Again, just an absolutely brilliant art job.
Yeah. I also think Dave McKean's one of those artists who he skirts that line between realism and surrealism, because there are a few panels where the characters look almost photorealistic, and then there's other panels where they look very abstract, and I think that's really unique.
Yeah, actually, it's funny. It reminds me of if you ever see the puppetry work of the Brothers Quay or Jan Svankmajer. Mm-hmm. If you ever see any of their sort of they have these really surrealistic kind of puppetry in their works, it kind of very much reminds me of that, where they'll have realistic items, photos, pictures, but then they'll have this really, really sort of weird, bizarre artwork that goes around around it. So it's almost like, you're seeing something familiar, but you're also seeing something unfamiliar at the same time. It's an interesting sort of feeling when you look at their art.
Now, we already touched on this, but I want to talk more about those themes of psychiatry and magic and, like, the possible relation between the two. I think it's interesting in the story how Arkham's mother, like during those flashbacks, you find out that she was having nightmares of some kind of bat demon. Now, on one level, you could just look at this as a coincidence, or maybe this is an indication of the true nature of time, that time is non-linear, and somehow she was seen into the future. Or you can interpret it as maybe this really was some kind of demon or spirit that was haunting her, and maybe even haunting the entire Arkham estate, and maybe even the entirety of Gotham City. And now in modern times, Batman, whether he realizes it or not, has become sort of an avatar for this entity. And maybe the reason the inmates at Arkham Asylum can't get better is, what if there is some kind of evil magic at work in Arkham Asylum? Or maybe there's nothing supernatural at all, and maybe this is all just a story about mental illness.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to unpack. You said a lot there, and really good. To me, this is really a story of dualism, like twos, right? That's sort of one side or the other, like the yin and the yang. So one of the first ones that start off, right, is that there's a researcher named T.C. Lethbridge, and he said that, today's science was just yesterday's magic. So that we often, I think, some sort of like make these two binary oppositions, that like magic is over here and science is over here. But I think in this work it says that they're probably much closer together than we think of, especially psychiatry and psychology, which really is an objective science, because a big part of psychology is interpretation. And as soon as you interpret something, you open it up to subjectivity. Right, you can't cut the mind open and say, like, well, here's the id and here's the, here's the subconscious. Right, it's so much interpretation. And I think, again, if you notice, one of the things that the Two Faces doctor uses, right, is she uses tarot cards. And again, tarot cards you have to interpret. Dreams you have to interpret. So the role of interpretation, I think, is really important in this in the graphic novel, by saying that, again, very, way back when people had mental illnesses, they thought they were being possessed. You needed a shaman to sort of come in and try to get that spirit out of them, to work with them, to reintegrate them into the community. And I think in some ways, I bet you Grant Morrison feels that that's what psychologists and psychiatrists really are now. They're almost like modern day shaman, working through this sort of the subconscious, what we have deep inside us, to bring this sort of out. So for him, maybe like neuroses, maybe complexes, mental illness is just a form of what you were saying about some sort of like demonic possession. Even something like schizophrenia, right? Or multiple personality disorders. Mm-hmm. Isn't that multiple personality disorder? Can we also see that as being you being possessed by something, another being inside you? You know? So again, that's one of the things I really see here. The other thing too that you brought up about that sort of Batman as the avatar, if you go into Jungian psychology, right, Jung believes that all of us have a shadow self, right? So we have the ego, which is what we show to the world, and then we have the shadow self, which is sort of all those things that we repress, all those things that are dark and alluring, that civilization doesn't want us to show, but that we have within us. So in some ways, right, was the Batman a symbol of that shadow self and seeking for balance, right? And that's the other thing with Jungian psychology, is we do have these two sides to us, and we have to seek balance. The reason why we have neuroses and we have complexes is because we're not in balance. We need to have the shadow and the ego in balance. If not, we can't achieve selfhood.
Well, and speaking of Carl Jung, there's a scene in one of the flashbacks dealing with Amadeus Arkham where he says that he met Carl Jung and also met Aleister Crowley.
Right. And again, there's the two sides, right? You have Crowley, who said that magic was the art and science of causing change in conforming with will. So you have Crowley, who was an occultist, but he saw it as a science. But then you have Jung, who was a scientist, who was very interested in things like flying saucers. He was interested in alchemy. He was interested in ghosts and poltergeists. So you have these guys that, again, are bringing together the two sides, right? We often think that a scientist is over here and the occultist is on the other side, yet you have people like Crowley and you have people like Jung who are both at the same time. They balance those things. And maybe that's why we remember them so well, because they were able to sort of bring these two extremes, these two things that we usually see as opposed. They were able to synthesize those things together. There's another part in Arkham Asylum where I think somebody gives Batman a word association.
Yes,
tests.
yes.
And of course, Jung created the word association. He's the person who actually created that tool to use to get at sort of, what was going on in the subconscious and what was, some of the issues that one might be having in their psyche. So absolutely, I think Jung sort of permeates this work.
What did you think of the characterizations in this graphic novel of Batman, the Joker, Two-Face, and Amadeus Arkham?
Well, again, with all the villains in the piece, what I think, again, going back to Jung, because Jung saw that our unconscious had a personal side and had a collective side. The collective side is something that links all of us because we're all the same species, right? We all going way back to the very first, the earliest human beings, is that we share that. So if you look at some of the villains, they have this sort of their personal quirks, but they also have archetypal quirks, right? Or archetypal sort of issues, right? Killer Croc, right? He's animalistic, but he's also, he's able to talk and use language, so he's got human aspects to them, So again, one of the things I really liked about the personification of these of the villains was that there was that mixture of the personal kind of quirks that they had, the personal behavior, their traits, but also there was a connection to the sort of the larger sort of archetypal collective primal kind of forces that that sort of molded us to become human beings.
What I liked about this is probably the most human we've ever seen Batman, yet at the same time the way Dave McKean draws him is so inhuman. Like, he's drawn almost to look like a demon, yet we see him probably at the most emotionally vulnerable we've ever seen this character.
Well, he's bat and man, right? He's animal and human. Bats come out at night. Human beings are, should be out in the day, in the sunshine and the reason. So he's the irrational and the rational at the same time. Again, goes back to that dualism. And the only way that Batman's going to be able to escape Arkham Asylum is if he's able to balance those two sides. He's got to be able to balance the sanity and the insanity. He's got the rational and the irrational, the animal and the human. And that's the way he can escape, right? This is what it is. He's got to achieve selfhood, which is the balance of the shadow and the ego. And I think that's what he's trying to do. What Morrison is trying to have him go through in the piece, right? Because if you remember, one of the tarot cards that is really important is the Tower. And in Crowley, in Aleister Crowley's Thoth decks, the Tower represents not only destruction but sort of rejuvenation, right? So in order to build something new, you have to tear down the old. So it's almost like you have to sort of destroy the old persona to build the new persona. So we have this sort of this feeling of that destruction and creation, again, are two sides of the same thing. You need both. You can't just have one or the other. You have to have both.
Yeah.
Right? And that's intrinsic to human nature, is that in order for something new, we have to sort of, destroy the old. So again, this is something that you see in Carl Jung. You also see it in Hermann Hesse, right? In Demian, and of course Hermann Hesse was a patient of Carl Jung, so that makes sense. But we also see it again in the references to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, right? And it's funny because I don't think he explicitly says it, but I have a big feeling that this work is totally influenced by T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, right? Eliot's writing after World War I. He sees the destruction, right? He sees that the world now, in his eyes, is spiritually, physically, emotionally, politically dead, and something's got to come along to rejuvenate it, right? And that's why there's the reference to Parsifal as well in the piece, right? And of course, that goes back to the idea of the Holy Grail, right? That Parsifal sort of searches for this Holy Grail so he can bring it back to rejuvenate, right? It's the sacrifice one makes to rejuvenate everyone. Yeah. Right, and it opens on April 1st, right? Mm-hmm. Again, in T.S. Eliot's, the first line of The Wasteland is April is the cruelest month. So again, I think that's interesting, the sort of connection that we have here, and it's almost like Arkham Asylum is the wasteland, right? It's the wasteland, and Batman has to rejuvenate it. Like, look what happens at the end with Two-Face. Mm-hmm. Two-Face is rejuvenated at the end. Batman has, sort of almost like the Fisher King. He's sort of come back and he's rejuvenated the lands. And again, I also feel too is that because if you look at the sort of older sort of those kind of myths like John Barleycorn, and it's that the old king has to die for the new king to go on and rejuvenate everything. So that's one of the things I wonder about it. Like, what does Batman leave behind there? What has he sacrificed in order to rejuvenate himself, right, and be able to go on? And I again, that's one of the illusions that I think that Morrison should have done more with.
A lot of Batman comics, especially The Killing Joke, are kind of like this idea that on a philosophical level, Batman and his enemies are essentially one and the same, because Batman was made what he is by trauma, and a lot of Batman's greatest foes were also made what they were by personal trauma, like Two-Face, of course.
And duality, right? Two-Face.
Yeah.
That's why Two-Face is such an important character in this, right? It's that duality, trying to find a balance between the two. His scarred coin, right? The two sides of a coin. I think that that Morrison does such a great job with twos, with duality in the piece. And going back to trauma, right? If you notice also mirrors, right? Mirrors are a big thing in this work as well. And I think that's a reference to Jacques Lacan. And Jacques Lacan was a French sort of like post-Freudian psychiatrist who believed that infants go through a stage called the mirror stage. And it's when an infant first sees its reflection. It's the first time that an infant realizes it has a self, but it also has not self, right? Because the mirror image it's a reflection, but it's not really the person, right? Yeah. So at this point, right, where we have a child almost goes into self-alienation because it knows it's a self by looking at itself, but the reflection isn't a self. So it's almost like it's self and non-self at the same time. Right? So that's the first sort of almost psychic crisis that a child goes through as an infant, sort of trying to figure out like, well, I'm this, but how can I also be that too? And what Lacan said was that children grow out of that if they have healthy relationships with their parents and they are validated. Right? They're validated and given attention. And then all of a sudden the child says, okay, I don't need the reflection. I understand it's a reflection. I have all these other people sort of validating me. But when you don't have that, right, the only validation you have is that other reflection. And the child sort of fixates on that narcissistic kind of image, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, that's what creates the neuroses, that's what creates complexes, is that fragmentation. You're not whole because you're divided. You think you're yourself, but you also think you're the reflection, right? And again, I think that's where if you notice, there's a lot of mirrors in here, broken mirrors, and again, I think that's where, where Morrison might have been getting some of his reasons for why the Arkham prisoners, the villains are the way they are.
Two-Face is my favorite Batman villain, yet here, he's not really a villain in the story. Like, he's so pathetic, like, when you first see him, like, he can't even make a simple decision, like going to the bathroom without his coin, like, the tarot cards aren't helping him at all, and you feel so bad for him in the story, and I like how at the end, when Batman gives him his coin back, saying, I'll let you decide what happens to me, you get this sense that it's almost a redemption for Two-Face, but not really, because it seems like he's going to just go back to the way he was. But it was almost like, even though Two-Face is insane, Batman's at least given him back his agency.
Yes, absolutely, because remember, that's one thing, is that when, so much of his character is based on, like, chance and deviation. Right. At one point, I think they even mentioned the I Ching, right, where that you throw up the pieces, and then as they come down, you analyze how they fall and look in this book, right, the Book of Changes, and it tells you supposedly your future, right. But again, what that presupposes is that everything has happened already. Right? How can you tell the future without it already having happened already? So again, I see like sort of Two-Face is stuck in this. This kind of, he's almost frozen because he's so afraid to do anything. He doesn't believe he has free will, right? He's a big believer in determinism. But by the end of the piece, right, Batman has given him back his free will. And I think that one of the things that Two-Face realizes is that his part of his meaning, part of his significance comes in opposition with Batman.
Yeah.
Right? Is that almost like, how we understand ourselves and how we understand our meaning and significance usually comes through butting up against the barrier, butting up against another force coming at us. And that's how we learn our significance. So again, without Batman, he would not have any significance. So that's why he lets Batman go, I think. If Batman would stay in there, then what significance would Two-Face have? I also think that Two-Face represents the fool. Right? April Fool's Day, right? It opens up on April Fool's Day. But in the old sort of pagan celebration of the new year, right? And that's what April Fool's Day is, pagan new year, because it's spring, right? Rebirth, renewal. That on those days, right, you had the fool and you had the king, and the fool and the king would reverse sort of roles, right? And the fool is able to, the jester is able to tell the king certain certain truths about himself that other people can't, because the fool, that's the expectation of his role. Right? And again, I think that Batman represents the king and Two-Face represents the fool.
I particularly enjoy the scene where Batman is with the inmates and one of them says, why don't we take off his mask and see his real face? And the Joker says to this inmate, oh, don't be so predictable, for Christ's sake. That is his real face.
Well, again, it's this question of, we put on masks in society, and the idea is with a mask is that, right, there's a real face behind it. But what if there is no real face behind it? What if we're just a series of masks throughout our whole life, and there is no real self behind it? All we are masks, which obviously that's what the Joker has embraced, right? That there is no real self, that every day you can reinvent yourself.
That psychiatrist in the book even talks about how every day the Joker's reinventing his own personality, that he has no real personality.
Right, and I think that's why he says that, no, the mask is, right, that the mask is our personality. The mask is not just a facade, but it is who we are, right? There is no real face behind that. And again, I think that perfectly sort of, exemplifies that in the way the Joker is portrayed in the graphic novel.
Now, what did you think of the characterization of Amadeus Arkham, the man who establishes Arkham Asylum? Because his whole story I found to be really compelling. Because it's almost like a self-contained horror story within this story. And I just found his story to be just so sad, and so tragic.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree with you. I agree with you, right? This person, again, is like trying to achieve these things, trying to sort of, find the ultimate meaning, to find sort of, what's really going on. And of course, do we ever really know everything, right? Do we ever really know every reason why people do the things they do, or what's really going on? I think that sort of becomes an obsession for him, which eventually destroys him.
And it just has such creepy imagery too, like the dollhouse scene where he finds his own daughter's head in the dollhouse. That's freaking terrifying. You wouldn't think you would see something like that in a goddamn Batman comic. It's
like he was so rational that it pushed him into irrationality. Like he was so rational in his scientific quest that he was too rational, and that actually pushed him over the edge into irrationality.
And it also plays on this idea of insanity being a hereditary thing, because we find out his mother had gone insane, and it's almost like she passed this insanity down to him. But then again, like, if you want to interpret that there's something supernatural going on, like the fact that his mother was seeing a bat demon or something, maybe he was just driven insane by the same force that is haunting the asylum.
Aren't dreams and memories ghosts? Aren't we haunted by memories and dreams our whole lives? So again, it's that sort of mixturing of the supernatural and the scientific, of, the occult and psychiatry. And again, it's always twos, right? It's always the duality there. And again, I think that going back to Jungian psychology, it's that the uniting of those two, of not seeing them as opposed, but seeing them as like two sides of the same coin. Yeah. Which again brings us back to Two-Face.
There's also a lot of Psycho references in it, like the fact that when Amadeus Arkham starts to really go over the edge, we see him put on his mother's dress. And then, like, in the present day, when the head psychiatrist at Arkham, who we find out is the one who's actually behind all this, has also gone insane from reading Arkham's journals. Like, he puts on Arkham's mother's dress as well, so there's definitely some Psycho allusions. I mean, there's even a scene where one of the inmates is watching Psycho on TV.
Well, again, if you look at the film Psycho, right, you have... There's almost like two endings to Psycho, right? You have the first ending where the guy, Simon Oakland, the guy who plays the psychiatrist, explains what was wrong with Norman, right? Sort of gives this whole sort of long psychological, and it makes sense. It's reasoned, it's objective, it uses all the right terms, But then it's funny that the film doesn't end there. You'd think it would, but then it ends, right, of course, on Norman, and his mother speaking in his mind. And I think one of the things Hitchcock's saying is that, yes, okay, you could have scientists sort of explain all these things, but they're not going to get everything, that there's something else at work here, right? There's something that the scientists can't explain. There's something else here that, science tries to make sense of it, and it can make sense of some of it, but again, it's only an interpretation. It's an interpretation that we choose to believe, but does that make it right? Does it make it true? Mm-hmm. The truth is that, right, Norman is what he is. You know what I mean? We could try to put any label on it. We could say he's possessed by his mother. Right? We could say that it's a psychosis or whatever, right? It's still what we're projecting onto that person. You know what I mean? And again, I think that's something that I think Morrison really believes in, right? Is that, again, it's like it just depends on your perspective, more so than there's absolute truth behind psychiatry or the occult or whatever. It's perceptions. It's how you look at the world. That's the way you look at the world is going to be reality to you. So if you look through it through a lens that says, psychology is an absolute science, and that's what everybody is, beholden to all those psychological theories, then you're going to see the world like that. If you're an occultist and you look at the world through the occult lens, you're going to see everything as being supernatural, paranormal. There is no right or wrong answer. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It's just like what is truthful to you in the moment.
Before we continue on with our analysis, I just want to cut to our friend John Riccadelli, giving his thoughts on this graphic novel.
Hello everyone, this is my short review of Batman Arkham Asylum, a serious house on serious Earth. This is one of the scariest and most confusing Batman comic books I've ever read before. It's hard to describe the plot. One way of describing it is, it's like being in a bad dream nightmare you want to wake up from. It has an Alice in Wonderland vibe to it with a Nightmare on Elm Street, and if David Lynch wrote a Batman comic book, this is how he would have done it. It's a very psychological horror graphic novel. One thing I might have gotten out of this comic, I'm not sure anyone would agree with me on this, it shows what goes on inside the mind of a patient who has serious psychological and mental issues, what their thoughts are and how they feel in the world, and how society has treated them in life. I've read this comic book before in the past, and it's still hard for me to think what to make of this comic book. It is good, interesting, unique, but a little confusing at times. The art drawings of this comic are very creepy, scary, and disturbing. Very different compared to what I'm used to seeing in Batman comic books artwork. I don't think I've ever seen this style of comic book art until I read this comic book. If people thought Heath Ledger's Joker was scary, when you read this and see the Joker's artwork, you might change your mind. I was reading how comic book fans pointed out that was interesting to me, that it did not occur to me when reading this article, is how the Joker is hinted as a homosexual in the graphic novel in this, and the Joker is in love with Batman. He's very repressed. We are seeing what is on his mind and how he feels about Batman. If they made an animated movie based on this comic, I'm not sure how it would be done, or how they would pull it off in this art drawing style. It would be cool to see this as an animated movie. Seeing last year's Robert Pattinson's Batman movie, it would be cool if they used this comic as a sequel. The deleted scene where Batman asking the Joker questions, the look is obviously inspired from the Joker from this comic book. While I do think this is a good graphic novel and respect it for what it is a very fascinating, cool, interesting, unique comic, but I'll admit, it's going to take me more rereads to understand this comic book. Thank you, Christian, for asking me what my thoughts are on Batman Arkham Asylum, a serious house on serious Earth. Hope you liked it, and see you next time.
I mentioned in my intro to this, all the literary allusions that this story has. You mentioned T.S. Eliot, and of course there's a lot of allusions to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and allusions to Robert Bloch's Psycho. But also, I wanted to talk about possible Lovecraft allusions, because obviously the name Arkham Asylum comes from the town of Arkham from H.P. Lovecraft stories, and yeah, there's not really any overt Lovecraft references in here, but I sort of got a Lovecraft connection in the sense that, again, if you want to interpret it that there's something supernatural going on, maybe Arkham's mother really did have an encounter with some kind of entity, and this drove her insane, which, again, the idea of seeing a monster and going insane is an idea right from Lovecraft, and even a lot of the stuff about the nature of time feels very Lovecraftian.
See, I think you're on much more stable ground to go with the time part, right? Because there's this thing in Lovecraft that almost like trauma trauma goes through time as well. So in other words, something that is traumatic in the past is going to follow until it's dealt with, until it's sort of exercised, until it's sort of brought out into the open. It's gonna follow the people. It's gonna follow that area, whatever. You know what I mean? It's almost like this this haunting that sort of that continues throughout space and time. Which I guess you could say like something like, The Shadow Out of Time, At the Mountains of Madness, things like that, Yeah. But yeah, I think that's probably the strongest connection I think you can make to Lovecraft is this idea of how trauma and time are interlinked.
Now, to go back to the Lewis Carroll connections to this story, I heard that Grant Morrison was inspired by young Stankmeyer, and I'm wondering if he might have taken inspiration from Stankmeyer's adaptation of Alice in Wonderland.
He might have. Like I said, though, he's very from the different interviews I've read by him, he's very contradictory. On one hand, he says that a big influence on this was, like I said, Young and Stankmeyer, Brothers Quay, that kind of weird, creepy, surrealistic kind of puppetry and animation. Yet on the other side, he's saying, well, I wish that McKean's artwork would have been more ultra-realistic. So it's like, which one is it? You know what I mean? So again, maybe it was. If anything, I think that it was McKean that was the one influenced by Jan Svankmeyer's Alice and those kind of things. That Morrison might have just kind of glommed onto it, after the fact, to take credit for McKean's artwork in a sort of indirect way.
I don't know if you're familiar with the band Taking Back Sunday, but there's this song, What's It Feel Like to Be a Ghost? And if you ever hear that song fits some of the imagery in this comic really well. And when I was reading this, I was listening to that song. Now, there was an episode of Batman the Animated Series called Trial, which was very loosely based on this comic. Granted, that was more of a watered-down, kid-friendly version of this story. I don't know if you've ever watched Batman the Animated Series. So
actually, I've heard like amazing things about it, but I never actually got to watch it.
It's a good episode, and it's a great show, too. But again, because it was a show for kids, it's a much more watered-down version of this story. Apparently, this was one of the Batman comics that Christian Bale read before he played Batman in Batman Begins, and then obviously the 2 sequels to that. Like, apparently this was one of the comics that, like, kind of made him really want to take the role of Batman.
Cool, that's awesome.
This comic was also a huge inspiration for the video game Batman Arkham Asylum, which itself spawned several sequels and spin-offs, as well as other Batman comics set within the world of that video game.
See the influence of this comic on 2022's The Batman with Robert Pattinson. Like, there were some aspects of that movie that kind of reminded me of this.
Yeah, I can see that, sure.
Now, apparently, there have been talks of a sequel to this. I don't know if anything's really materialized from that yet, but Grant Morrison said that it would be very Philip K. Dick inspired if he did a sequel, so...
Yeah, I don't know about that. I think that Morrison loves to almost take these famous superheroes and mess with them just to mess with them, and just to almost go again, rile up the readers, rile up the fans, So I don't know. Like I said, I think his work on Invisibles I thought was amazing. I think it's one of the great series, But aside that, I'll be honest, I'm not like a huge fan of his.
Besides this, I've only read one other Grant Morrison comic, and that was Nameless, which I do recommend. It's very Lovecraftian if you ever get a chance to read that. I know he's done other work with Batman. Like, I think he actually created the character of Damian Wayne, who is Batman's son later on in the comics. From what I understand, though, his later Batman stuff is nowhere near as surreal or as nightmarish or horror-based as this comic was. Like I said in my intro, I kind of count this comic as being standalone. I don't really count this as being part of the larger DC continuity. I consider this to be more of a self-contained Batman story. I don't know where you stand on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. The continuity, I can't even keep up with all the different continuities and all the things that have happened in comic books, so I guess so, I actually wonder what Alan Moore, I don't think I've ever read if Alan Moore's ever read this, or what Alan Moore's take on this was. I know he's not a big fan of Grant Morrison himself, but I would be curious to know what he thinks about this, if he even bothered reading it.
That would be interesting. I do see a lot of Alan Moore in this comic. Like, I mentioned before how this has a lot in common with The Killing Joke, and also a lot of stuff about the nature of time in this is very similar to how Alan Moore tackled the nature of time in Watchmen and From Hell.
Yeah, I agree. I think so, And again, I mean, some people have said that, is that how we mark comic books? Like, BAM before Alan Moore, and then like after Alan Moore, So like maybe, so many things after he came around are going to be influenced on them. Even if it's not a direct influence, it's just that he cast such a huge shadow over what was going on that you couldn't help but be affected or influenced by it, even in the most indirect ways.
This is one of my absolute favorite, not just Batman stories, but it's one of my favorite horror comics as well. What are your final thoughts on this book?
Oh, I think it's very enjoyable. And again, as I got older and I understood more of the references, I really enjoyed it. But again, I think to me it's more of the sort of the structure, I guess, of the piece itself. Like, I love the individual references. I love the characters. I love the artwork. And Gaspar Saladino's lettering is amazing too. I forgot to mention that. His lettering for this is just unbelievable. Most times letterers are, I'm not to put down letterers, but it's kind of like, pretty standard. But his lettering for this is an art in and of itself. But anyway, I just don't know if I feel it hangs together as well as I used to feel.